Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday. So, starting in January this year, I started going live each Sunday to answer student questions about the upcoming AP Lang exam. So, if you're just joining, welcome. My name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I also make tutorial videos for students on YouTube and TikTok. And we are a few weeks away from the AP Lang exam. So, I imagine that there might be some students with questions. And so, if you have any questions about the AP Lang exam, whether you want to know about multiple choice or the FRQs, go ahead and leave your question in the comments below. I'd be happy to help answer it as much as I can. All right. So while we're waiting for some questions, I figured I would just kind of give like a couple tips. Like these are things that I'm telling my students to do over the next few weeks because the exam is pretty close. So one thing to do would be to make sure that you are practicing your FRQs as best you can. I like to give some of the recent prompts to my students. And if you have not written a full essay yet, like if you haven't timed yourself yet, that would be something that you can do on your own because that's probably one of the hardest things to manage is the pacing for the exam. I think that's what really makes the exam tough is like the amount of expectations you have and the time constraints. So that would be one thing to do. Something else that you can really pretty easily incorporate into your routine, if you will, is just kind of broadening your outside knowledge. Thank you for the likes, by the way. So, for instance, like I think the hardest essay is the argument essay. For me, that would be the hardest. And because like you have to come up with your own evidence on your own. So, one thing I'm having my students do is I'm having them make a list of like the top 3 to 5 historical figures that they feel like they could write about best, maybe 3 to 5 historical events that they could write about. Um, 3 to 5 current events. And that way, hopefully, by thinking about these things in advance, it can help prepare for the exam. So things like making sure that you're keeping up with current events, listen to podcasts or listen to like YouTube videos, TED Talks, read articles. That's something kind of simple that you can be doing to help prepare. Also, if you're in other AP classes, like for instance, APUSH, if you're studying for APUSH or AP World or AP Euro, then you are already kind of studying a little bit for AP Lang as well. All right, so if you're just joining, welcome. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have in the comments. We have a question on YouTube. It says, are the SAT reading section questions good for preparing for the MCQs in the Lang exam? Yes, they are. So I would skip the first passage, and this goes for ACT and SAT because usually the first passage on both of them is going to be some kind of like literary narrative or fiction. So I wouldn't do those because that's not what we assess on AP Lang, but the other questions are pretty similar. On the SAT specifically, the questions about graphs, you don't really need to practice answering those because you're not going to have any kind of like multiple choice question about a graph. The only time you'll see a graph on AP Lang is in the synthesis portion. So it's possible that it might be one of your sources. So if you want practice interpreting the graphs, you can definitely do them. But just in general, you don't need those. And then also on the SAT, they have questions where it's like, what is the best evidence for the previous question? And you don't need to practice with those as well. Like if you want to, you can. But to the best of my knowledge, they don't phrase it that way on the AP test. So yes, you can definitely use SAT tests to practice for AP Lang MCQ. I find that those are actually better practice than some of the test prep books out there. So I would definitely encourage you to check those out. And there's, I think, like 10 SAT tests out there. So if you literally just type in like SAT practice test and you pull it from the College Board's website, it's called like the SAT Suite, I think, like SUITE. That has like all the info that you need, and there's different tests there. So that's one of the ways that you can practice the MCQ for sure. And then that's the reading MCQ. The writing MCQ, some of the questions on the writing and language SAT are similar. Most of them are not. It's like harder to find them, but anything with like a question stem where it's like, the writer wants to add the following sentence here, or like anything about transition words or things like that, those are on there. But the questions about like where it's like subject verb agreement and commas, those are not. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing the live and for the likes as well. Feel free to ask any questions that you have. Where is my wig from? It's not a wig, it's real hair. But thanks though. Always got to have one troll in the comments. So today it's you. Um, do you have students practice MCQ in class before transitioning to MCQ and FRQ? So we do a little bit. So I have my students do basically like there's 3 practice tests on AP Lang, like the AP classroom. I have them do those outside of school. We have like these study sessions that we do. So if you're able to do a mock exam for your students either during your school day or after school, that can be super helpful. But I like to have them practice a full length test at least once during the year. And so I give them the MCQ that's all 45 questions. I make sure that we do that when we have a full hour because our classes are 45 minutes. So in class, since I don't have a full hour, well, I'm sorry that you were offended, but you also, this is to the person on TikTok, you also just asked me if I had a wig. That's very rude, and I don't. If you don't want to listen to my videos anymore, that's absolutely fine, but please understand that your comment was rude. So anyway, the progress checks on AP Classroom can be helpful, but the thing that students tend to not like about them is that they jump around a lot. So it's like the good question practice, but there's a lot of passages involved, so they don't get as much from one single passage. So I would say that one of the things to work on would be to give students either an SAT passage, possibly an ACT passage, just kind of knowing which questions can be helpful and time them, because one of the big issues that students have is that they spend too long, especially on the reading questions. So if you can give them like the opportunity in class, and if students are watching this and you want to study, what you can do is it can really be helpful to, once you know the right answers, go back through and justify them. So for instance, like if you got, let's say it's question 2, if you got it wrong, when you find out the right answer, go back and try to find the like right answer in the text. Like go find that evidence and say, okay, here's the right answer. This is why it's right because. And I even sometimes have my students tell me why a couple of the other answer choices are wrong, because that can be really helpful as well. So if you're looking to practice MCQ, the best resources I have found would be if you have access to the stuff in AP Classroom, the full length tests are the best. Progress checks are okay. SAT passages are good, and you can time yourself or your students for that. Another good source is the AP Lang course exam description. They have 17 questions in that one. So those are really good practice as well. Unfortunately, it's just 17 questions, but those are a really good option if you're looking for like some publicly released ones. And I would say we kind of go back and forth. I focus a lot more on the FRQs than the MCQs, but students do need practice with both for sure. Let's see. Do you have any tips on improving vagueness in the FRQs? So that's a good question because we want to make sure we're being as specific as possible. And that really starts with your thesis. You want it to be really clear what you're going to be addressing in your essay. You also want to have those topic sentences be very clear. Like, this is the main idea of my paragraph. And then also specific evidence is going to help. So it depends on which essay we're talking about, because usually for synthesis and rhetorical analysis, students quote things. And so when you are quoting something, you want to make sure that you are choosing a relatively short quote, because sometimes what happens is students use these really long quotes and it's more of the other person's words and not your words. And it's a lot harder to analyze. Like the longer your quote, the more commentary you're going to need. And you want a decent amount of commentary anyway. But you want these like shorter quotes. And for rhetorical analysis, you want to kind of dig into their word choice. Like, why are they using these words in the quote that you chose? And what are the details and things like that? So that would be important. For an argument essay, you're not quoting anything, but you're having to come up with examples on your own. And that can also be where students struggle, because sometimes the examples students choose are maybe not specific enough, or they're maybe like they're specific, but like maybe students don't explain it well. So let me give you a quick example of what that could look like. In an argument essay, if you just say something like World War II as your evidence, that's probably going to be too vague, because World War II can mean a lot of things. But if you were to narrow that down to like a specific aspect of World War II, that's going to be more specific. So I would encourage you to choose specific evidence to avoid vagueness. There's some things you can do stylistically too that can help. So it's going to seem really simple, but when you write the word this or any other demonstrative pronoun, so like this, that, these, or those, always put a noun after it. Even if you think it's really obvious what the this is referring to, it can really help. So like instead of saying like this means, say like this example or like this quote or something like that. And that way it clarifies what you're talking about. Another way to avoid vagueness in general is to focus on your word choice. So if you focus on correct like adjectives and adverbs, then that's going to make your writing more precise as well. Because for instance, if you just say something like, that's kind of a plain verb, but he states, well, that doesn't really tell us anything other than somebody said it. But if you said like he logically states, or he logically claims, or he boldly claims, well, then by adding in like logically or boldly or patriotically, whatever it is, adding in those adverbs, that will help you be more precise as well. So definitely add in adjectives and adverbs when you can in your writing. So one of the questions on YouTube is, if students do well in the FRQs, do they do well in MCQs? It kind of depends. Like this is where I've heard at like the reading and like some of the trainings that I've been to that there's supposed to be kind of like a correlation between like how well students do on an MCQ versus an FRQ. But as a teacher, I've seen a lot of exceptions. Like I've had some students who are very strong at MCQ and then not my strongest writers. I've also had some of my strongest writers not be so great at MCQ. And then I've had everything in between. I've had some students be like the top of both and that kind of thing. So if you want to look at it from the sense of if they can write well, can they understand passages well, then yes. But there's not always a direct correlation. So I would say it's important for students to practice both. However, I think it takes students longer to get more comfortable with the FRQs. That's why we practice those like all year. I think it's like a lot longer for students to like get totally comfortable with that. And I say that because like I have my students from like 10th grade. Some of them I have all the way through 12th grade. It just depends on which classes they take. And we start rhetorical analysis and a little bit of synthesis as sophomores. And like that is super helpful. But by the time they get to junior year, we kind of refresh it. But like this point, like we just finished our second round of rhetorical analysis. By this point, they're really digging into the passages and they're having insights that they definitely would not have had in the same way come August. So it's important to realize that like students grow over the year too, because it really does take a lot of practice sometimes. Okay, so let's answer some more questions over here on TikTok. Let's see. Okay, so my teacher hasn't prepared us for the exam at all. How can I prepare on my own? So, okay, these are the things that I would say you could do on your own. One would be if you haven't done a lot of timed essays, definitely try that. There are past exam prompts online. So that's what you Google is like AP Lang past exam prompts, like past as in PAST. And then it'll pull up everything. I would start from like last year's exam, which sometimes is on a different page when I search for it. So if you can't find it, just type in like 2022 AP Lang prompts. But I would look at anything from like 2022 and I would go as far back as maybe 2017. It's not that the prompts before that are bad. It's just that like they're not always as accurate because around 2019, they started to change a few things with how they word it. So I try to keep the prompts pretty current as far as like what I use in my classroom. So if you haven't done one of those yet, definitely do a timed essay. And I would encourage you to try to do like if you have like a weekend maybe where you can set aside a few hours, I would encourage you to try to write all 3 essays because one of the big issues that students have is not that they don't know how to write the essays, but they don't know how to pace for them. And so on the exam, you get 2 hours and 15 minutes for the FRQ section. And they recommend about 15 minutes for reading and then 40 minutes to write each of the essays. So if you haven't practiced a timed essay, then it would be really important for you to do that. My students do most of their timed essays in class, and sometimes we do timed essays at our after school study sessions. And that can really help as well. So that'd be one thing you can do on your own. We were talking earlier about doing SAT questions to practice on your own, specifically the nonfiction passages from the SAT reading section. And then there are some questions on the writing and language section that can help as well for the writing multiple choice. I would also encourage you to, if you can, just kind of brush up on current events or other things for the argument essay specifically, because sometimes students struggle to come up with good evidence for that. And so if you are like studying like a historical event or a historical figure in a push, really pay attention to that. Like keep up with current events, just because you never know what you're going to want to write about. But the biggest thing I would recommend students do at home if you feel unprepared is just practice with the timing. And the sample essays that I was talking about, or the prompts that I was talking about, have sample essays that you could look at, so you can kind of compare your writing to the student samples and kind of see like how you do as well, in case like you don't have someone to score it for you. So that can be one way that's really helpful. For rhetorical analysis, the purpose is always to persuade. It's not always to persuade. So sometimes it kind of depends on what the rhetorical situation is, right? So like, I suppose you could say that there's a persuasive element to it, but we want to think of it a little bit more specifically than that. So for instance, one year they had a commencement speech as the prompt, and a commencement speech is like what you give at a graduation ceremony. So instead of saying to persuade, I might say that that one was more like to inspire or to motivate, because if you're talking to graduates on their graduation day, you want to inspire them typically. Now, a few years before that, the prompt was a eulogy, which is a funeral speech. And so I wouldn't say that the purpose of that was really to persuade. I would say the purpose was to honor the deceased and to like shape their legacy and things like that. So some passages could be meant to persuade. Usually, if there's like an argument, they're trying to persuade someone of something, but there are other purposes as well. So even though the passage might be persuasive in different ways, the passage is not, or the purpose is not always to persuade. There could be other purposes as well. Let's see. We have a couple questions on YouTube. So let's see. Whenever I go to write an argument essay, my essay is often filled with basic evidence. How can I make my essay more sophisticated? That's a great question. I would say the hard part sometimes is like what students choose to write about. And I understand, because the pressure is on. Sometimes it's really hard to come up with like these strong examples. So we tend to see a lot of like the same evidence being used across the board. Like certain political figures or certain historical figures tend to come to mind more. And so you really want to make sure that regardless of what evidence you use, you want to make sure that you're explaining why it matters. So always make sure that you give us a couple sentences of context, even if you're talking about somebody really famous, like George Washington, Rosa Parks, and you're like, yeah, my reader's going to know who they are. That's true, but always tell us a little bit of background information about them. That way it helps your evidence make more sense. Because one thing that you need to know is that AP readers can't infer. So if it's not on the page, like we can't be like, oh, well, they probably knew this. So with your evidence, give some specifics, give a little bit of context, even if it's personal experience, because you can write about personal experience too. So I would say do that, and then really make sure that you are explaining how your evidence answers the prompt. And I know that might seem really obvious, but that's where a lot of essays fall short, is like they give us an example, but they don't ever actually say what the example means in relation to the prompt. Or if they do, it's like really simplistic. It's like let's say the prompt is the disobedience prompt. It would be like, and this shows the value of disobedience. Well, why? Like, what do we learn from it? You had to have chosen this example for a reason. So really think about like what the message of the example is and like why it's relevant. I think that would be the best thing. Something else that has helped some of my students is like when they're brainstorming before they write. And I think you should definitely brainstorm or outline. It can be quick, but like sometimes our best ideas are our first ideas, like, oh, I'm definitely going to write about this. Some students have that experience. Other times my students will come up with something and they're like, okay, this made me think of this, which made me think of this. And they're like, that's the one I'm going to write about. So sometimes it helps to just kind of like, I know it can be stressful because the clock is ticking, but like try to just kind of think about what is the evidence that I could write about best. to prove this claim. And also think about your order too, because you want to make sure that you're putting your evidence in a logical order. So is it going to be chronological order? Is it reverse chronological order? That kind of thing. So that can help as well. And then with argument too, because you asked about how to make it more sophisticated and developed, the key I think is going to be really pushing your commentary. Um, some students try to go for sophistication by having a counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation. If that feels natural to you, like if it feels like it fits what you're trying to say, then go for it. But don't force that kind of thing, because so many times I've seen essays where like a student just kind of like threw in a counterclaim and rebuttal just because they probably felt like they had to, but it didn't really help their argument. Once students take the exam, what data do we as a teacher get once everything is scored? So that's a great question. So students are going to receive their composite score. So unfortunately, you don't get a whole lot of data as a student, and you get a little bit more as a teacher, but not much. So if you're a student, you're going to get, it's going to say like AP Lang exam, and then it's going to be a number 1 through 5, hopefully some 5s. All right. And if you take other AP tests, it'll be on there as well. And you can send those scores to colleges. There's like a deadline for, I think you get to send it to one college for free. We at my school this year are encouraging a lot of our students to do that, depending on where they want to go to college, because it saves them paperwork later when they're seniors. Just as like, obviously everyone's situation is different, but if finances are an issue and you want to send that report, you get one for free. I believe. And I think it's like each year. So if you're like doing it your senior year too, I think it's like one per year. But like there's more to say about that, I think. So you'll get, as a student, you'll get your composite. You unfortunately don't get to know how many multiple choice you got right and what your essay scores were. We can kind of tell ballpark from like what your composite is, what you might have done, but there's a whole lot of ways to earn a composite of a 3, a 4, and a 5. Now, as teachers, you will get an instructional report, and sometimes it's not available. Like, I think I usually get it the same day I get scores, but like, I don't want to say it's always available. But we get a breakdown of like, I'm trying to think what's on it. I know you can kind of figure out if you know how many kids you had per class, you can maybe figure out if they got the sophistication point or not. Like not who did, but how many did, because you kind of get like percentages. It'll tell you like the different types of questions kind of, and like what students did. Like it'll tell you like number of students that earned a thesis and like how many students got like on row B, like this score, like a 2, a 3, or a 4. So it's kind of helpful. And it also compares it on the side. It'll tell you like if it exceeds the national average or the global average or things like that. So like like the past 2 years, I've had smaller numbers. So the instructional data for me was very helpful because I knew exactly how to interpret it because I just had like a small class, like just like one section of it or 2 sections of it, like about 30 kids. But if you are a teacher with like 100 students and you have multiple sections, you should be able to kind of compare like class to class too. So it doesn't tell you everything you need to know. It doesn't tell you individual student data, but it will tell you like as a class how they did, which can be helpful. How many essays or writing assignments do you assign per FRQ type? So I try to assign a lot of like paragraphs throughout the year, and then we build to essays. I'm assigning more essays now. We're doing like one every other week approximately. But in like the first semester, it was like maybe one every month. I would say maybe 2 per 9 weeks because we do 9-week marking periods. So I try not to like do too much like and overdo it because for me it's like easy to assign too much writing, I guess, if that's a thing. But I try to have students write a lot of like paragraphs where they're really focusing on like developing their claims, because that can help. If you can write a good paragraph, you can write a good essay. So yeah, it's also what I can keep up with grading wise. Is ChatGPT a reliable source for grading practice essays when provided with the rubric? I haven't tested it myself. I know of a couple of teachers who have tested it and they said it was mostly accurate, but I haven't personally done it. But that's a good question though. I haven't really used ChatGPT for much, but it could streamline the process, but I haven't tried to use it. Let's see. Let's look for some more questions over here on TikTok. But thank you on YouTube for asking those questions. For argument, what is good evidence to have in the back of your mind? Um, that's a good question. So it's going to differ from person to person. Play to your strengths. So, like an activity that I have my students do, I actually just assigned it to them, but it's like I have it like open for 2 weeks for them to complete. Is I call it a database, a Q3 database. And all they do is like they have these like tables to fill out, and I have them choose like 3 to 5. I think the first one is like 3 to 5 historical figures that they can write about. And so they basically like have a box where they put like a summary of who the person was. And then they provide some like kind of like commentary on like what the person like reveals or shows us, that kind of thing. And so they have different categories. So there's like historical figures, historical events, current events, personal experiences. But basically, I have them do this because it's a way for them to kind of like zero in on what they could write about best. And I've done this in different ways, but last year was the first time I did it in that format. And about half my students told me after the exam, like when they could talk to me about things, about half of them said that they used something from that assignment. And the other half were like, nah, we just went with whatever, which is totally fine. But it's a way to get you to kind of realize what you're like, for lack of a better term, what you're an expert in. So like if you have studied, I don't know, like George Washington in history class a lot, and you're like, I know a lot about him, I could use him as specific evidence, then go for it. If you are like a sports fan, like let's say gymnastics is your thing and you know a lot about like Simone Biles and you're like, I can connect Simone Biles to a bunch of prompts, then go for it and make sure that you could write about these people knowledgeably. Because I always find as like someone reading the essays and as a teacher too, that like when students clearly know like the evidence that they're using, it makes it very interesting and it makes better evidence. So like we do a state mock exam. Not all schools participate, but several do. And a few years ago, we used the overrated prompt. So basically students had to identify a person or a concept that was overrated. And basically, the person that like the most memorable essay that I read from our state mock exam that year, they wrote about Russell Westbrook. And I am not an NBA like fan. I don't follow that kind of basketball, but this student clearly was an NBA fan and they wrote it almost like sports journalism. Like they had very clear claims and like statistics and explaining like why this person was overrated. And I remembered that essay because I was so interested in it. Like, and I didn't even know who this guy was. So part of that, all that to say that you can play to your strengths. So if you are very knowledgeable about like a certain political figure, historical figure, current event, whatever it is, use that because usually that's going to be a lot more interesting than if you just go like for the obvious. Now, I'm not saying going for the obvious is bad because you can definitely know about some of the more common people, but I would say try to choose stuff that you can clearly talk about. And so that idea of the database, if you will, is just to get you to be a little bit more familiar with like, okay, these are the things that I could talk about for an essay, including personal experiences. Like don't discount your own experiences. You are allowed to write about them. How specific does the evidence need to be? So we want it to be as specific as possible. And thank you for the likes, by the way, on TikTok. And also if you're watching on YouTube, if you'd like to give it a thumbs up, that would be fantastic as well. You need to provide appropriate background. Like don't just assume that the person reading your paper knows. Because like, for instance, the Russell Westbrook paper, I have zero clue. Like I don't even know if I knew at the time he was a basketball player, if I wasn't told. So like assume that they don't know. Now, what if you're writing about somebody who's super famous? Like, I don't know, like Rosa Parks, you can still explain who they are. Don't just like throw them into your paper. So also it's important to remember that AP readers come from all over the country and international. So we had a couple people like fly in from different countries last year at the reading. But you had people like me who I'm on like the younger end of AP readers. Like we have people in like their like late 20s, early 30s. And then we have people in like other age groups as well. We have people from all parts of the country. We have most of us are high school teachers. Some teach at public school, some teach at private school. There were some college professors there that are readers. And so you can't assume that like you're writing to just like your teacher. You want to make sure that you clarify because the person might not know. So if you use a pop culture reference, Make sure you clarify who this person is and why they're important. And that also helps with your line of reasoning as well. So you want to be as specific as possible as you can be with like the context, and then really give some commentary. In what order should you do the essays if you don't have one that is stronger than the others? I would say if you're not strong, if they're all equal, I would do them in order, just because I feel like synthesis kind of takes the longest anyway because it's the most involved. And then to me, like rhetorical analysis is also kind of involved. And I feel like argument, you could write a decent essay with less time. Like I think you could write a decent argument essay in like 30 to 35 minutes if you had to. So if you don't feel like any one essay is your strength and you're not trying to prioritize that one, I would just do them in order. Just personal preference, I think though. But yeah, you can write them in any order. Russell Westbrook is not overrated. I don't know. This person had a very convincing essay. They clearly were not a fan. Hey, AP Bio Penguins, thanks for joining. I'm scared for the multiple choice. Okay, don't be too scared about the multiple choice because there are 45 questions. They're all worth 1 point. And you only need to answer approximately half of them to still be on track for a qualifying score. Now, there's going to be a range because you also have to factor in your FRQs and things like that. But I tell my students, especially the ones that are struggling, I tell them that I want them to try for 23 out of 45. And I tell them that because I know that sometimes if they make like a 21 out of 45, but their essays are still decent, that they could still make the cut score. So you don't want to stress too much about any one section of the test because we want to make sure that we're not getting like this defeatist attitude either. So if the prompt is super hard or if the passage is super hard, just keep going and you can skip around. Just make sure that if you do that on the paper test that you don't mess up your bubble sheet. But like sometimes if the passage is hard, the questions are easy for multiple choice. And sometimes, unfortunately, if the passage is easy, the questions are harder. But like I've even had students who really hate multiple choice go to the writing questions first. Those are the ones, it's usually around question 23. And it's like, this passage is a draft. They tend to like those better. So they start with that because they're like, okay, I'm usually pretty accurate with these. It's like less stressful to them. So they start there and then they work their way to the harder questions because it's really kind of like a game if you think about it. You're just trying to answer as many questions right as possible. And so you technically can skip around within your section. So if you're on multiple choice, you can answer them in whatever order you want. If you're on the FRQs, you can answer them in any order you want. You just can't go back and forth. They're separate tests, like booklets anyway. So, but you can't be working on multiple choice when you're supposed to be doing essays and things like that. But don't stress too much about the multiple choice because the hardest question on the test and the easiest question on the test are still worth 1 point. So just make sure that you answer every question. If you're not sure, make an educated guess, try to use process of elimination, but you don't have to be perfect on multiple choice. I think that's part of the issue sometimes is like students are so used to like having to be like at like 90%. And that's not always the case for multiple choice for AP Lang. Are there outlines when it comes to the body paragraphs? So I recommend that you do kind of plan your main ideas and possibly your evidence. But as far as like the structure of a body paragraph, we want a clear topic sentence, evidence, commentary. I tell my students to have layers. There are a couple exceptions to this, but like in general, you want evidence, commentary, and a concluding sentence, which is going to like restate your main idea. Don't use the concluding sentence to preview the next main idea. Use it to kind of wrap up your paragraph. Sorry, I talk with my hands. So if that's distracting anyone, I apologize. But the only exception I would say in general is for argument essays. If you have like one really solid example and you're like, I can't think of two examples that go together, that's fine. But like for rhetorical analysis, we want to try to find a couple short quotes that you can kind of weave in. And so you have evidence, commentary. The same for synthesis, because it's a recommendation, not a rule, but I recommend that students try to put 2 sources per paragraph because you want to create what we call a conversation of sources. So if you have one paragraph where it's like, okay, this is source whatever, let's say source A, and then you highlight source B and then source C, even though you have 3 sources, it can kind of feel disjointed. So, and if you have 2 sources, you're going to have kind of like what I call 2 layers. You also, in case anyone is curious, you don't need 3 body paragraphs. You can if you want to, but technically you just need 2. So do what's best for your essay. Most of my students, I write 2 body paragraphs just because they don't really have time for like 3. Sometimes they do. Some prompts are kind of easier to write. I've always had trouble writing RA. How do you structure your body paragraphs? Your video was helpful. Well, thank you. So for the body paragraphs for rhetorical analysis, it helps if you analyze the passage chronologically. So think about what is the writer or speaker doing at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then like if you're doing 3 body paragraphs, if you're doing 2, just kind of be like first half, second half, I guess. So think about what they're doing. And if your claim is a bit more broad, I was talking about this with a group of students last night because I was doing a tutoring session and we had like a small group and we were talking about how like sometimes when we choose a rhetorical choice, like repetition, sometimes that can be really narrow because what if they only repeat one word? It's kind of hard to develop a whole paragraph. I mean, can you? Yes. But instead, we were talking about how like you could, for the passage that we were looking at, it was like the president was acknowledging the devastation or the tragedy that had occurred. And then, yes, there was repetition within that. So instead of saying repetition, if we said like, I'm paraphrasing here, but acknowledges the tragedy, then we could talk about like multiple things within the paragraph to prove that. And then it was easier to select evidence. So that might be something to think about as well, is you need that topic sentence, evidence, commentary, concluding sentence. But your evidence should be short. Like, please do not choose these huge quotes. Really also think about like the word choice within your quote as well. Sometimes that's something I'm doing with my students more recently, because sometimes students put a quote in there and like, yes, it proves the point that they're trying to make, but they don't really unpack the speaker's word choice and like talk about like why they're using those words. And so they're kind of like limiting their commentary. So that would be something to consider as well. Also with rhetorical analysis, you really want to think about the rhetorical situation. So for your commentary, ask yourself, like, why are they making this choice for this audience on this occasion? Because the commentary is the why. So really think about like why they're making these choices, because speakers tailor their speech to the rhetorical situation. So if they're speaking at a graduation ceremony, they're going to make different choices than if someone's speaking at a funeral, because those are 2 totally different situations, right? So really think about why they're doing that. Let's see, I had a question on YouTube. It says, after my student did synthesis and we reviewed argument, they want to use 2 pieces of evidence for argument. They don't need 2 pieces for an argument essay, correct? Yes. So like in a body paragraph, they technically don't need 2 examples per body paragraph. They want like probably 2 examples total, and I've had students do both. I used to try to encourage my students to have like 2 related examples, and a lot of my students still tend to do that. But then I had other students say, you know what, I feel like I can develop this one example in this paragraph and this other example in this paragraph, but I can't come up with like 4 total examples. And I realized, it's not about the quantity of examples, but the quality. So it's really just like what they feel fits their argument best. So yes, it's okay to have like main idea 1 and 2 examples in there, as long as they are related and they have commentary for both. Or you could just do one example. So most of my students have between 2 to 4 examples in their essay, depending on how they structure it. Do questions in your argument essay strengthen or weaken your argument? That's a good question. It really depends on like how you structure it. So if it's like, sometimes the questions come across as like a bit cheesy if you're like asking a rhetorical question, but I have seen some students do it well. So I wouldn't force it, but like if you feel like it would be a logical question to ask, like if it would help drive your argument further, then go for it. Because I have had some students do it where I was like, oh, that was a good time to ask that question. But then I've also seen it where it was kind of like a little bit cheesy or like not needed. So it really depends on like what you're saying. But if you think it fits, go for it. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to like jump around here. So if I missed someone's question, I sincerely apologize. Okay, so for rhetorical choices, should I say they are using pathos or should I say it differently? Try not to use the words logos, ethos, or pathos. If you're going to talk about those things, talk about logic, emotion, but tell us which emotion. And then like credibility or reason, depending on how you want to say it. I do have a video on my channel and I believe a blog post as well. If you type in like something like Coach Hall writes rhetorical appeals, there's a whole video that I have that I think would really help you. Because, and I'll give you some tips here too, because you're here now, but just like FYI, I have a video that I think would really help explain that in more detail. So for instance, with emotion, we don't want to say the writer uses emotion because that's kind of vague. Like lots of writers use emotions. We don't really know what you're saying there. So at the very least, we want to say appeals to, and then we want to say like what the emotion is. Because if they're appealing to fear, that's very different than if they're appealing to patriotism or nostalgia or something like that. So always specify the emotion. You don't even need to necessarily use the word emotion, just tell us what the emotion is. Also, remember that choices create appeals. And this is kind of what I talk about in that video that I mentioned. So, like, for instance, if you notice that it's an emotional appeal, because in your example, you said that they're using pathos. Ask yourself how you know it's emotional. Usually it's probably because of like details or maybe word choice, maybe the examples that they're giving. Sometimes people give logical examples and sometimes they give emotional examples. So, what are they doing? Like, how did you know they were being emotional? And instead of like having your whole topic sentence be about using pathos, have it be about the choice that's making the appeal. So let's say it's word choice. So like their whatever type, maybe their like somber word choice is evoking a sense of pity. So that would be another way to say it. Instead of saying like uses pathos, you could say evokes a sense of, and then it's like insert emotion here. And that way, you're analyzing a choice and the appeal that it creates as opposed to just focusing on the appeal. So hopefully that made sense. But I do encourage you to check out that video because I think it might be helpful. And I'm pretty sure in the description of that video, I have like a handout that goes with it in case that helps. Thank you for sharing the live on TikTok. That's very helpful. How do you use personal experience in your essay? Do we switch to first person? Yes, you can. So it's actually, if it's personal experience, like, yes, please use first person pronouns. So here's the thing, and this is where my advice might differ from what you hear from your teachers, and if so, that's okay. In their class, use their rules, but for the exam, you are able to write about personal experience. Some prompts lend themselves to it more than others. Like a couple years ago, there was a prompt about striving for perfection. We had a lot of examples when we did this as our state mock exam, and it was on the official test as well. So for our state mock, we had a lot of examples of like students doing sports and striving for perfection, or like academics and striving for perfection, like a lot of, I want to be valedictorian kind of things. But if you choose a meaningful example, it's okay to write about. Sometimes like that's like the first thing that comes to mind. And the College Board knows that y'all are students. And so while you might have a whole you have a whole lifetime of experiences, you have teenage experiences, and it's okay to write about that. So I think sometimes people dismiss personal experience because it's like not as sophisticated, but I have read some really good personal experience examples. This is what I would encourage you to think about is it a meaningful example? So I had read an essay from a student a while ago where it was in response to last year's prompt about timely decisions. And because I know the student, I have a feeling that this was a made up example. But they were talking about like how a cousin fell out of a tree, broke their leg, and the timely decision was like, do they call 911? And while that may have happened, it may not have. It didn't really feel like it was the best example of a timely decision. So if we're using personal experience, we want to try to make sure that it is a strong example to prove our point. And I say this knowing that it's sometimes really hard to come up with examples on the spot. So I'm not knocking that example. It just there were other examples that felt stronger, just like it felt more genuine. So you want to make sure that you are that you're providing a meaningful example. I do have a video on my channel and probably a blog post too about rating about personal experience. And so if you want more info on that, please check out that video too. One of the things that I talk about in that video though is just making sure that it's meaningful, making sure that it makes sense to someone who doesn't know you, because that could be the other downside as well, as sometimes there's a whole lot of backstory. And if you are not able to express that, sometimes the like example doesn't come across as well. So make sure it's meaningful, make sure there's a clear lesson. But yes, use personal pronouns. Don't try to turn it into like a hypothetical. So don't turn it into like, suppose a college student did this, or suppose a high school student did this. Because those come across as generalizations. So make sure that it's like an actual example. Now, the other question that I sometimes get is, can you make up examples? And technically the answer is yes, because we won't know. Some examples, like, they kind of raise a red flag of like, I think this is made up. But like, again, even if it is, there's nothing I could do about it. So make it believable. Don't turn it into like a sob story on purpose or something. But I will say this, one of my top students from last year made a 5 on the exam. And you can't talk to your teachers too much about the test, but like, after the prompts are released, you can talk a little bit about the test. And so all I found out from her, and she's the daughter of one of my coworkers, so I've known her since she was like 7. She said, I wrote about George Washington for something, and I said, okay, that makes sense because her mom teaches APUSH. And then she's like, and I wrote about my sister, and I just burst out laughing because this girl does not have a sister. She has a brother. So I don't know what story she supposedly told about her sister, and she was very strong on all aspects of the exam. So like, I don't know what her argument essay was like, but she was like, honestly, in that moment, I could not think of anything. So I just made it up. And she's like, I'm sorry, but that was the best I can do. And honestly, I don't think there was anything wrong with that. Like, she did the best she could in the moment. So I'm not saying make up fake examples, but you have to appreciate the task at hand. So just do the best you can, and it's okay to write about personal experience. So anyway, I just find that funny because I will not forget that she she made up a sister. Can you read my college essay next summer? Possibly, yes. I will be switching a little bit my content from like, right now it's a lot of AP Lang stuff. In the summer, I do some college prep stuff. So some of my videos will be about that, just because a lot of juniors then go into their senior year. If they've taken AP Lang, they then go into senior like college prep. So don't like unsubscribe or unfollow as soon as the AP test is over, because I will talk about some college stuff. Should I take AP Lang next year? I would say it is a very valuable class. There's a couple things I would encourage you to consider. One is what your current teacher recommends, because every school is different. Something else is, do you like English, and do you like nonfiction? I would also encourage you to maybe talk to people who are currently in the class, because every teacher is different. And my school, this year, at the beginning of the year, I had a lot of sophomores who were like, oh, I don't know if I want to take it. And then like, I had my current students go talk to them, and they're like, what are you stressed about? And because sometimes students have like a misperception of the class. So, and then now I have a lot more AP Lang students next year signed up, which I think is a good thing. But it's because sometimes they hear AP and they get scared. And so really talk to people who are currently in the class, but also know that everybody's opinion is different. Like, if they maybe had a bad experience, it might just be their bad experience. But like, definitely talk to your current teacher, talk to people in the class. But out of all the AP classes, I think this one has the potential to be the most valuable sort of universally for students, because when you go to college, you're going to be exposed to nonfiction and you're going to have to write about it. And so the skills that my students have learned in AP Lang, most of my students have gone on to be something other than an English major. I think I literally have like one former student who's an English major right now. Most of my other former students are doing other things, and they have come back and said, I am so glad I learned how to write, because they learned synthesis, which is like basically research. And they're like, research papers were a lot easier, or they knew how to analyze rhetoric. And so that had different benefits in college as well. So I do think the class itself would be very valuable, but without knowing your situation, I don't want to say absolutely, but I don't want to discourage you either. I think it's a valuable class. And if you decide to take it, then I will, as long as TikTok's around, I will be here to answer questions. If not, I'm on YouTube as well. Do I have to know about US history and politics? No, you don't. A lot of students tend to take like a US history class during their junior year anyway. So they tend to like bring up US history evidence. And a lot of the prompts lately, with the exception of the Gandhi prompt from 2019, have been kind of like a US based prompt, but that could change. So no, you don't have to have an extensive knowledge of US history to be successful in the class. I'm self-studying AP language. Awesome. I was wondering if footnotes questions are going to be tested. No, they're not. That's a great question. That was on the previous version of the exam. They changed it back in they started to change it in 2019. It was implemented in 2020, but that was also the COVID year. So that test was like kind of odd. It wasn't a full test. But long story short, that was one of the things they took out was footnote questions, which is kind of a shame because those questions were usually kind of easy. If I'm being honest, like my students tended to like those. But if you encounter a footnote question on a previous exam, then those questions are not on the exam anymore. So you will not need to know those. I'm taking the digital exam. Yes, the digital exam. Um, so I haven't looked into it too much because my students aren't taking it, but they've made changes to it from the last time they did a digital exam, which I like. So I think the test will be as like equal in caliber and like the testing experience will be as equal as they can make it. So if you're taking digital, I wouldn't stress about it. But I'm hoping that like there's a way for digital test takers to practice. There's something that's called like Blue Book. I think that's the name of the program. And I'm hoping that there's a way for y'all to like get used to the software first. The one thing I will say is my students took the ACT digitally. And I know it's a different platform, but we tell them on a paper test we call it a straight line bubble. So like, let's say there's like 2 minutes left and you have like 10 questions left. We tell them pick a letter and bubble that same letter all the way down. Don't try to make like a pattern or a picture or anything. And one of my students this year said that it was really stressful because she was having to like, I guess on the ACT, like click the answer and then like click the next button. She said there was a lot more clicking. And if it took a second to load, it was like super stressful. And she was like, it would have been faster on paper. And so that would be one thing that if you're taking the digital test, if you are wanting to skip around and stuff, that's fine. But if let's say you're on question 5 and you're like, I really want to come back to this question, there's a way to bookmark it. But I would almost encourage you to like pick an answer anyway and just as a guess and then bookmark it. And that way, because you don't want to have to be clicking a bunch of stuff to go back in and fill in anything that you missed, if that makes sense. So just kind of try to make sure you answer everything, but try to possibly minimize the clicking. I don't know. After you take the digital test this year, if you have any tips that I can pass on to next year's cohort, let me know. But that was something that one of my students said for the digital ACT is she's like, I had not taken into account the amount of clicking to try to rapidly bubble stuff in. Our students who have bad handwriting in danger on the exam? No, not really. Honestly, we can read a lot. And if we can't read it, we send it to like, there's like kind of like a chain of command. So let's say I get somebody's essay and I can't read it. Then I give it to my table leader and it's all digital, by the way. So there's a way to like send it to them and they can look at it. If they can't, they send it to somebody else. But as English teachers and teachers in general, we're used to a lot of handwriting issues. I would say a couple things that help would be not writing super, super tiny. We can like zoom in on your paper, but it helps. We can also actually change the color. So like some of the essays that were really hard to read, we would change the background color. There was a way to make it like blue or something, or like some people did like fluorescent pink and it made it easier to read. But if your handwriting is naturally super small, try not to write super, super tiny. Try not to like connect a bunch of letters, like make distinct letters. Cause sometimes like when it's a scribble, it's hard to read. I also have a student who, it was previous years, had kind of messy handwriting. So they decided to start writing in all caps and it made it easier to read. So I don't know if anyone wants to change their handwriting and start writing in all caps, but for that student, it worked. But for the most part, like we're able to read it. It's usually just that we can't read like certain words, but if we can get like the gist of it, it's okay. So don't stress out too much about handwriting, but like, yes, there are some times when it is really hard. Let's see. I know I've missed some comments on TikTok. So if so, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to go back through tips for AP Lang multiple choice. I actually just posted a video about this. If you're interested for like like full tips. It has like both reading multiple choice and writing multiple choice. It's pretty recent on my channel. I've been doing a lot of YouTube shorts too, because like trying to take TikTok knowledge and put it there too. But if you go to like my most recent like full video, it's AP Lang multiple choice, and there's some tips there. But just because you're here now, just wanted to give you like an additional resource. But some tips that you might consider would be for some students, it helps to read the questions before reading the passage. This doesn't work for everybody, but if you feel like you struggle with pacing or comprehension, someone I saw had asked about comprehension earlier. Sometimes it helps to read the questions first because you at least then know what you're looking for. Don't read the answer choices though, because that would just make it more confusing. If you are really struggling to know what the passage is about, really focus on the verbs, because sometimes that can help you figure out like the tone and things like that. Sometimes they have like a sentence above the passage where it's like, this passage is from, I don't know, like 1855, or something like that. And that can really help too. And it just takes a second to read that. So I encourage students to read that because sometimes they give you a clue like in the description of it to tell you like what it's about. And sometimes that really helps. A lot of the questions can be answered just by going to a certain line or a certain paragraph. So if you're pressed for time, definitely go for those questions first, because you can usually kind of like, if it says what's the function of the first paragraph, you can usually read just the first paragraph and have a good idea of how to answer it. So those you can answer more quickly. Many of my students tend to prefer the writing questions, which is like the second portion of the multiple choice. So usually around question 23 to 45 approximately. And those are kind of like editing questions. So those tend to be a little bit easier for many students. So make sure you're pacing yourself correctly so that you have time to answer them. And I would recommend that you answer all questions, even if it's a guess, because there's no penalty for guessing. So you want to make sure that if there's 45 questions that you answer all 45, even if it's a guess. Because you at least, there's 5 answer choices, so you have a 20% chance of getting it right. Let's see. Couldn't writing in all caps be considered a grammatical mistake? No. Well, I see what you're saying, but no, they don't count it against you. In fact, grammar doesn't matter as much as you might think it does. They do tell you on the prompt to like make sure you try to have good grammar, but these are viewed as a rough draft. And so they like, while it's helpful if you use punctuation correctly and stuff like that, even some of the like top essays that have a perfect score like have spelling mistakes or like minor grammatical errors. Also, for what it's worth, like I have had a couple students in the past who have had either like dyslexia or dysgraphia or other like challenges. And so like it would almost be unfair to like for instance, like if writing in all caps helps you like write more neatly, it would, to me personally, this is just my opinion, I'm not speaking for the College Board, but to me personally, it would seem unfair to penalize somebody for that. Same with like spelling mistakes. Like when I first started teaching, honestly, I corrected like every spelling mistake that I could. And people are human. I've had typos in my videos and stuff. You know, it's just not as big of a deal, especially because they're viewed as a rough draft. So we care as readers, we care more about your content than your grammar. And also some students, English is not their first language. And so sometimes that plays a factor as well. So just if anybody's like, oh, I'm a terrible speller or like something like that, just don't stress about that part. Just have good content. That's the most important thing. Let's see. Thank you for the likes, by the way. Let's see. Trying to see, what is your process for recommending for organizing yourself? Okay, so I think for all essays, but you're asking about argument, but for all essays, I think it's important that you know your thesis ahead of time. Like you don't have to write the full thing, but like know your position and plan your evidence, like plan your main ideas. I tell my students like they can vary this approach, yes, but I tell them like jot down your thesis and like main idea 1 and write it down, main idea 2 and put your evidence if you want to. For synthesis, I tell them to kind of jot down which sources they intend to use. And part of the reason why I tell them to do that is because usually I do a mock exam with my students. I didn't do it this year, but I did it last year. And when I've done a timed write with my students, and I was the one writing it, I felt like I did an experiment a couple years ago. One year, or for one essay, I planned it out and I had like an outline done. And I ended up spending more time on the outline than I thought, so I only had like 30 minutes to write the essay. But it was a much more pleasant experience because I knew exactly what points I wanted to cover and I was able to adjust. For the other essay that I did, I didn't plan it at all. I just started writing. And that essay I think was way worse. And it did not feel as good. It felt like it was more disjointed. So I would recommend having like a very simple outline of just like, here's my position, so your thesis, and then like what your main ideas are and your evidence. And also, if you think of something as you're reading or planning or whatever, and you're like, oh, I really want to include that in my essay, write it down because so in grad school, I had to take a standardized test, and like for teaching, we have to take like it's called a praxis test. And I remember for one of the prompts, I had like I don't know what the idea was, but I was like, oh, I really want to talk about whatever. And then like I got to that part in my essay and I was like, what was that I was supposed to talk about? And I could not remember. So the next time, and it ended up being okay. But the next time I took a standardized test, the second I got an idea, I just wrote it in the margin. I put like a big circle around it. And then when I got to that part and I was like, what was that one thing I wanted to mention? I knew exactly where that note was. And it was super helpful. So like, don't trust yourself to remember stuff under pressure. Write a note. With just 3 weeks left, what do you suggest for revision? So it can be helpful if you're like wanting to revise past essays. I have a couple tutoring students who are going through some of their old essays right now and like either rewriting them to see like if they would approach it differently or if it's stronger or whatever, or just like revising them. So for instance, let's say they got a score of like a 130 and they know that one of their paragraphs was weaker than the other one. They might try to revise it to make both paragraphs equally as strong. So that could be helpful as well. And then if you're talking about like for review, that's a little bit harder because I guess one of the benefits of AP Lang is that it's not like other classes like APUSH where you have all these like things that you have to remember, like dates and stuff. There isn't like a whole list of things to remember, which is good, I think. However, there's less to study. So the way I personally would study is I would practice writing prompts and looking at student samples and just kind of like knowing how I want to approach the exam. Maybe like brushing up. We've talked about this on the live so far, but brushing up on like possible examples I could write about and things. But there's not really as much you can do to cram, which I think is kind of a good thing. What is I read that one already. Sorry. Let me see what we got down here. Thank you for the likes and the shares. That's really helpful. Okay, I'm trying to find, I thought I skipped a question on TikTok and I can't seem to find it. So if I missed your question, I sincerely apologize. Please feel free to re-ask it because sometimes when it scrolls, sometimes I might miss something. AP Lang took the scary meaning of essay away. Now rating an essay is easy. That's good. We want it, like as teachers, we want you to feel like comfortable with it. Obviously, there's still a little bit of anxiety on test day. But we want you to be like reasonably comfortable with it. Usually my students that like, I don't know, I find it kind of funny. They're like, when I ask them like, how was it? They're like, oh, it was everything we did all year. Like as it should be. So, and honestly, the other thing too is like, one of the conversations I sometimes have with my students is like, what do you do in moments of panic? So, let's say you get a passage and it's super hard. And it's very easy to be like super defeated and be like, I'm going to fail. Okay, we don't want those negative thoughts because it's just one portion. Like that's why it's a composite score. So please don't let any one component deter you. So for instance, if you feel like one writing prompt is really hard, that's okay. Usually it's Q3 that my students hate, but every year there's always one where students are kind of like, ugh, didn't like that one. And honestly, as teachers, we kind of look at them and there's always one that's probably like our least favorite of the three. And that's okay. So if it gets hard at any point, like don't let that discourage you because your composite is going to be kind of like an average, if you will. Like, so it's okay if something maybe doesn't go according to plan. Just keep the task in mind. So you know how to write a synthesis essay, you know how to write rhetorical analysis. Do those things, like have a thesis, have 2 body paragraphs as best you can, have evidence and commentary, and like you will at least earn some points. That's kind of the frustrating thing is when students don't even try at all. If you can write a thesis and at least 1 body paragraph, you will get points for sure. Let's see. The thesis point is like super lenient. How long should a conclusion be? So you technically don't need a conclusion, but if you want to write one, they're usually kind of short. It kind of depends on what your objective is. So many of my students don't actually write a conclusion. Like I actually had a student a couple weeks ago like joke with me that that was the first time all year she'd written a conclusion. And it was because we had talked about the prompt quite a lot in advance, and I had told them like, "Hey, if you write one, try to do this." And so she was like, "I actually got to do that." But normally, some of my students don't get to, and that's okay because they're focusing on their body paragraphs. So if you write a quick conclusion, sometimes students just write a couple sentences. That's okay. Usually, when we see that, it's like them just restating their thesis, which like could be helpful, but it's not totally mandatory. But like, please don't force yourself to write a conclusion if you feel like you're falling behind. It's okay to just have like an intro and two body paragraphs because these essays are viewed as a draft. Now, for a conclusion, if you're trying to like make a strong conclusion, one thing that I would recommend you try to do is to like zoom out to situate it in a broader context. And so what that could mean is like for rhetorical analysis, I have my students try to answer one of two questions. If the prompt asks them about a message, I have them try to answer, how is this message relevant today? So you're kind of going beyond the passage in your conclusion. And kind of like, so if the message is about identity or something, or like perseverance, how is that relevant today? And that can be really helpful. The other thing is some of these passages are tied to like either important people or important figures in, well, that's the same thing, important events or important people in history. And so sometimes it can be helpful to analyze the historical significance if you know it. So, like, if you know that like America then went to war after this, or America united together, or something, like if you know any kind of like the history behind the event, that can go in your conclusion as well as like a this happened next. So that could be a tip for like rhetorical analysis conclusions. And for synthesis and argument, it's kind of, some students kind of do more of like a here's why it matters. Like you kind of answer that in your essay anyway, but it's more of like a like big picture, here's why it matters thing. So anyway, conclusions can be really short, or they can be non-existent. That's okay too. My teacher hasn't talked about synthesis yet. That's stressful. I are you on like a half year class? Like, are you on a block schedule or is it like a whole year? Because with 3 weeks left, hopefully they can help you with that. I do have some videos on it if you would like. I have like some videos on like how to write a synthesis and things like that. So if you want additional resources, I would encourage you to check out my YouTube channel. And I've been doing like a tip of the day on TikTok. So the past couple days have been synthesis tips. If you haven't talked about synthesis yet, I would really encourage you to go online and read a synthesis prompt and read some sample essays, especially the ones that scored well. Because of all the essays, rhetorical analysis and synthesis are kind of the two harder ones if you've never seen them before. And I say that because I teach synthesis to my students in sophomore year. It's the first time they've ever had it really. And we do rhetorical analysis first, and then we switch to synthesis for a little while. And every year that I've taught it, I've realized like no matter how much I explain it, until you see the essay and see how the citations work and stuff, it doesn't totally make sense. So I started showing my own students sample essays sooner. Like we would kind of go through the prompt and talk about it. And then I would be like, okay, here's an essay, because otherwise they were kind of lost. They were like, I get all the sources and I know I'm supposed to make an argument, but how do I do this? So I would encourage you to look, if you're not familiar with synthesis, I would encourage you to look at some of those sample essays, because I feel like when you see a synthesis essay, then it starts to make sense. How hard is it to get a 5 on the exam? It kind of depends. So I've shown this on a few previous lives, but it might be backwards. If so, I apologize. So like they give you a score range. And so this is not exact, but approximately 73 to 100 points. So if each multiple choice question is worth 1 point, and then you take your essays and you take whatever number you get out of 6 and you multiply it by, I think it's like 3.0566. You take that, you add those numbers together, you get a number between like 0 and 100. You round it after you've done all the adding and stuff. So to get approximately 73 to 100 points, you want to be shooting for at least probably 35 right on the multiple choice, give or take. That can be helpful. And then ideally 5 out of 6 on the essays. But again, like if you got a 6 on one and a 4 on the other, it kind of averages out. So you can just kind of play around with those numbers. There are, to make it easier so you don't have to do all the math yourself, there's some online score calculators. I think Marco Learning has one, and Albert IO, I believe, has one. So you can just kind of take and like plug in your numbers and be like, okay, if I had this many multiple choice and I scored this on my essays, what would I get? And you can kind of play around with it to see like exactly how hard it would be to get a 5, because it's kind of relative. Like for some of my students, my top students, it's admittedly because English is their strength. It's not super hard for them to get a 5. But if they were to take an AP test in something that was not their strength, it would be very hard to get a 5, right? So for some students, it's easier than others. I have other students for whom like their goal is a 3. And as a teacher, like I just want my students to do the best they can. I have celebrated a kid getting a 3 just as much as I have celebrated a kid getting a 5. I had one of my former soccer players get a 4 and I almost cried because of how hard she worked. So, just keep that in mind, that it's kind of relative as far as how hard things are. The number one tip for MCQ, I guess technically it would be answer all questions, just because like if you don't answer it, you don't have any potential to get it right. And I guess like as a secondary tip, pacing, because a lot of students struggle with their pacing. And so what happens is they end up having to rush because they haven't paced well. So if you have an hour, usually the reading questions take a little bit longer. So maybe like I wouldn't spend more than like 35 minutes on the reading. The writing you can maybe do in like 25. But when I've seen students do like a practice test and it's like 40 minutes in and they're still not moving on to the writing passages, I'm like, you got to pick up the pace a little bit. So like pacing and answering all questions is probably the biggest thing. How does commentary differ in synthesis and argument? Okay, so that's a great question. So for rhetorical analysis, the commentary is more about the rhetorical choice and the rhetorical situation. For synthesis, you're still explaining your evidence, which is probably coming from the sources. But it's more of like, what does this show? Like, what does this demonstrate kind of thing? Like, it's still, all commentary is really the why and the so what. But instead of analyzing the choice in relation to the rhetorical situation, you're more looking at like the big picture of like, why does this matter? So like if you have a statistic about, let's say for the wind farm prompt, it said at one point like wind energy was 1,164% more efficient. Okay, cool. Why does that matter? Well, your commentary could talk about how like in an energy crisis, we would still have wind and it would be important, to have that. Like, so you go with the why. Like, okay, so you have this fact, so what? Like, why does it matter? And then for argument, it's kind of the same thing. You're coming up with your own examples. So it's kind of like, what's the message or the takeaway? Like, what does this example show us about the topic? It's a full year. It's a full year and you haven't started synthesis. Okay, well, please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you, but I would definitely recommend checking out those previous exam prompts and essays so you can kind of see it. And then I have a playlist of synthesis stuff on my YouTube channel, and I'll be covering stuff on TikTok. But please, like for your own sake, because your teacher hasn't covered it, like please do your own independent research. Synthesis isn't super hard, but I want you to be prepared. And it kind of scares me that you haven't covered it yet, but maybe you'll cover it soon. That's okay. Maybe it's because if you've done argument, some teachers do argument first and then they spend less time on synthesis because a lot of the strategies overlap. So optimistically, if you've been doing argument, maybe your teacher's just waiting to switch to synthesis because it'll be a little bit easier to do that since you've done argument. So maybe that's why. What I learned in AP Lang perfected, my writing samples and got me into my top pick master's program. That's awesome. Yeah. Someone was asking earlier about like the benefits of taking AP Lang. And one of the things I had said, and I'm so glad you commented this, is that it can help you with like future classes and like college and career and things like that. just because the skills are very versatile. So congratulations on getting into your master's program. That's really awesome. What are you studying? I'm always curious, like, because my master's is actually in creative writing. But there's some really cool master's programs out there for various things. All right, so I've been on for a little over an hour. So if anyone has any final questions about AP Lang or the test, I would be happy to answer it. But I usually go live on Sundays around this time. So for me, I'm on Central Time, so it's like 2 p.m. Central. I try to stay on for about an hour and a half. Um, Oh, our teacher gave us the Q3 prompt on adversity. Yeah, that one can be a good one. Adversity is kind of like a very open topic to talk about. And they did an adversity prompt on the exam like several years ago. And I think I give my students like an adversity one that I kind of tweaked a little bit. So yeah, that's a good one to practice, a good topic to think about. How can I get the sophistication point? That is a good question. Oh, international. Wow. Okay, that is like okay, your master's program sounds really interesting. Props to you. That's awesome. Um, okay, so sophistication. Oh, this is so hard to explain for argument. I feel like I can talk about sophistication for rhetorical analysis pretty easily. For argument, I feel like it's the one where I see sophistication the least. And maybe that's just like my personal experience or my personal opinion. But a lot of times when students do get it, it's because of a very like nuanced argument. Like we're not looking at like the absolutes. Like we're kind of looking at, okay, in these situations, it's this, but in these, it's this. So you're not arguing both sides, but you are arguing like a qualified position. So that can lead to nuance, which can help with sophistication. I would also say that something that sometimes helps is like writing style in general. So the students who use like vivid language, like adverbs and adjectives, and like have a strong command of grammar, like using colons correctly and dashes, that can help towards like the style component. So that could help as well. But I feel like in general, the sophistication point is very difficult to earn. Really focus on those evidence and commentary points instead, if you can. Like, not that you shouldn't go for sophistication, but really focus on the evidence and commentary. What's the lowest score I could get on an MCQ with 4 out of 5 on the essays, or 4s and 5s on the essays? So it kind of depends. It depends on what you're trying to go for. I tell my students in general, if they score 4s on their essays, if they can get 23 out of 45, they should comfortably get a 3 composite. Like, could you get a couple less? Like, could you get like a 21 out of 45? Yes. But I have found that if you get 4 out of 6 in your on your essays and 23 out of 45, you're kind of comfortably in that bubble for a 3, if that's what you're going for. I made my nonfiction writing skills really strong and made my research papers easier. Yes, absolutely. Let's see. Okay, I think this is like a multi-part question. Oh, okay, it's in relation to the adversities prompt. Okay, let's see. So you said I was trying to negate the notion that adversities elicit talents. However, I got it to, I guess, for making a paragraph on my counterclaim. Okay, is there a certain amount of evidence I should have to get all 3 points? So that's a good question. So, okay, most of my students write 2 body paragraphs, and they have to have at least 1 strong example per body paragraph. Some of my students prefer to do 2, like they kind of do 2 related examples. If you're going to bring up the counter argument, which you can for sure, a lot of students like to do it as like a 3rd body paragraph because if you don't have, because you only have 40 minutes, if you don't have time to write it, then you could just like scrap it and you would still have the 2 body paragraphs that you did. So that's kind of like not how I used to advise it. I used to tell my students, like, sometimes it's better to have it be your 1st body paragraph. And in some cases it is. Some students have plenty of time to write it and it really works. But the more I've taught it and the more I've kind of watched my own students who like to include a counter argument, the more I've realized it probably for timed situations makes more sense to put it as body paragraph 3. Because that way, if they like can't get to it, then like if they just omit it from their essay, nothing's lost. Like they still have those other points. And so that would be something to consider as well. And you don't have to have a counter argument. What social media would social media be good evidence for the overrated prompt? Yes, as long as you break it down very specifically. So as long as you're able to explain why it's overrated, like what components of social media are overrated. Um, because some students might choose like a specific app instead of saying social media in general, or they you could talk about social media in general and maybe talk about like how there's different components of it that are overrated. You would just want to make sure that you give very specific examples of that. So you'd want to talk about specific times, either when you yourself have experienced something or like some kind of, there's a lot of like social media, like scandals, if you will, and things like that. So you want to make sure you have very clear evidence to support your reasoning. But yes, you could technically write about social media. That'd be fine. The overrated prompt, I feel like, is kind of different than the other ones because it's like this topic and you come up with reasons and there's evidence within that. But like the other prompts are more like example based, if that makes sense. I don't know. The overrated prompt I like, but to me, it feels very different than the other prompts they've done recently. My fear is not really a fear, but like I'm waiting for another prompt like that. Like I have no clue what they would ask, but I'm waiting for another one like that. I just want to pass. Well, I hope you do. Just be very like methodical, like just really make sure you understand how to earn those points. Talking about different social media aspects. Okay, so like, tell me more because I do think that could be a fair thing to talk about for overrated. I've seen several examples for that prompt, and students have written about everything from, I was talking earlier about, I have read an essay that was actually really good about Russell Westbrook being overrated. And then I've read one about Moana, and you wouldn't think like writing about a Disney movie is the best way, but this was very convincing. I've seen some that are a lot of like standardized tests. There were even kids who wrote about like AP being, or like the SAT and stuff being overrated. So there's all kinds of stuff. And then some students have done like their sample essays about the Electoral College being overrated, competition. So there's a lot of different ways to answer that prompt. You just want to choose like one clear topic though, because some students kind of switched around and they like gave like a different paragraph about different things. Like it would be like, I don't know, like social media and then competition or something. You don't want to choose like a bunch of different examples. You want like one topic with multiple reasons for that particular prompt. Is there a clock that students can see on exam day? So if you're taking the paper test, there's supposed to be one in your room. And I think if you're taking the digital test, it's on your screen. At least that's what I remember from previous times. Here's the thing about the clock though, is like, so I can't give the AP Lang test, but I can give other AP tests at our school. And like we have like this clock that we had to put up, and it was really hard. Like I couldn't hang it on the wall, so I had to like put it on a table. And so like I knew very clearly that not all students could see the clock, but there was nothing I could do about it because I couldn't hang it up. So I say this because I don't want you to like depend on a clock. I would recommend that you get, if you can, I know not everybody has extra money. I totally understand that. But if you can go to like Walmart or whatever your equivalent is and get like a inexpensive watch, like some of them are like $5. Maybe with inflation, they might be closer to 10. I don't know. But a lot of my students have gotten like the little kid watches because it can't be a smartwatch. It can't be a Fitbit. It can't be anything that could like send or receive messages. But in previous years, some of my students would have like a competition to see who could get like the cheesiest one. And so like I had guys, male students showing up with LOL dolls, and like there was like a Groot watch and like Sonic the Hedgehog, and like they would use these for all their AP tests because it's just like a little digital watch, and it can't send or receive messages. And that way, if they can't see the clock in the room, they can at least keep track of their time. Something else that you might want to do is like, I had a couple students tell me this really helped them last year. I had told them, write your start time for each of your essays at the top of your page. And that actually helps because there have been a few cases where the person proctoring the test did not give students the correct amount of time. So if you know when your start times are, and you know you're supposed to have, let's say, 2 hours and 15 minutes, you can kind of keep track of like that. I wouldn't stress about that too much because it's very rare that there's any kind of issue with that. But it's more for like you independently. Like I had students tell me it was helpful like to write, let's say it was 10 o'clock. I'm just making that up, but like they would write 10 o'clock, and that way they knew by 10:40 they were supposed to be done. And so they would write like their start and stop times on their paper. So having an inexpensive watch can be really helpful. And if you don't have the opportunity to buy one for yourself, but you have friends who are taking other AP tests and maybe they're not AP Lang students, maybe you can like share one. Like maybe you could have it for one test and they could have it for the other or something. I don't know. You can't share a watch in the testing room. But anyway. But yes, there's supposed to be a clock, but you can't always see it. Or sometimes students have trouble reading it. All right. Any other final questions? Thank you for those that were liking it on TikTok, and welcome to those who just joined. I'm about to kind of wrap up here, but I do go live each week, each Sunday. As the exam approaches, I'll be going live more frequently. So if you are new here, my name's Coach Hall. I have a TikTok and a YouTube channel where I give AP Lang tips. So if you have any questions about anything, chances are I probably have a YouTube video about it as well. So I would love it if you would check those out. I also offer tutoring if you're interested. If the links are in my profile, if you're curious, if you want extra help. But please join these lives and ask questions because I know the exam can be really, really stressful. I'm trying to like eliminate some of that stress for y'all. So I'll stay on for just another second to answer any final questions that might come in. Thank you so much for the likes and for sharing the live. I'm hoping to go live since there's like 3 weeks left. I'm hoping to go live a couple times a week now. I just don't know like which days, but that way, in case students have more questions, I can answer them. And if you all have specific questions, if you think of something after this, if you're on TikTok, at least you can go to one of my recent videos and just leave a question. I will try to respond either like through text or like through a video response. Because a lot of the questions that students ask, I think really would benefit multiple people. So I'm trying to create like shorter videos on TikTok and also on YouTube Shorts to like make sure that that people get the answers that they need. All right, you're so welcome. Thank you for those that joined on YouTube as well. I really appreciate it. All right, I don't see any final questions. I hope I didn't skip any. So I'm going to go ahead and end the live, and I'll be back hopefully sometime this week, definitely next Sunday as well. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great week. Bye.